What runs through a general's mind when he feels the shift, when the forest goes quiet and suddenly he's the prey? Dense, damp, silent, the Teutoburg Forest doesn't scream its threat. It waits, alive, listening, holding its breath like a beast before the pounce. And in that breath, Rome's illusion of dominance was quietly suffocated. It wasn't a clash. It was a disappearance. 3 entire legions, over 15,000 men, vanished without a formal battle. No triumphant horns, no grand final charge, only silence broken by screams that would never reach back to the Senate. In less than 2 minutes, you'll see how arrogance became Rome's greatest enemy, how one man, trained by the empire itself, dismantled it from within. The year is 9 AD. At the fringes of Roman territory lies Germania, untamed, dense, and seething with the unknown. For the imperial machine, it was a border to be pacified. For Governor Publius Quintilius Varus, it was an assignment wrapped in routine, a province to be administered, not fought over. But beneath that green canopy waited betrayal, sharpened not by foreign hands, but Roman-trained ones. Enter Arminius, a man forged by Roman steel, educated in its doctrines, fluent in Latin command structures, and yet his blood carried the pulse of the Germanic tribes. Rome saw a loyal auxiliary. Germania saw a leader. He was both, and neither. While Varus paraded through forest trails with protocols and scrolls, Arminius charted the minds of his enemies and his opportunity. What happens when a commander trusts his interpreter more than his instincts? Varus, a seasoned but politically burdened general, dismissed tribal warnings. He ignored his own scouts. He followed a trail designed not to reach a destination, but to become one. The greatest enemy of a good plan is the dream of a perfect one, by Karl von Clausewitz. The Romans didn't just march into a forest, they marched into a strategy, a trap years in the making. In the days to come, you'll watch Roman columns stretch thin over muddy trails. You'll feel the panic ripple through formations as rain turns shields into anchors and orders into noise. You'll witness Arminius, not just leading a rebellion, but orchestrating the psychological collapse of an empire. This isn't a story about swords. It's a story about perception, betrayal, and tactical timing. A hybrid war long before the term existed. Why did Rome, at the height of its power, fall to a man without a state? Because sometimes the sharpest weapon is familiarity. This is the betrayal that crushed Rome, not at its gates, but in its confidence. This is the trap no legion escaped. This is the Teutoburg, and the forest still whispers their names. But what Rome didn't see was that the betrayal had already begun. What if the forest wasn't quiet at all, but just waiting? You've just stepped into the beginning of a story that rewrote the confidence of an empire. If this moment stirred something in you, curiosity, unease, that sense of standing at the edge of something bigger, then stay, because what comes next isn't just war, it's collapse, whispered through the trees. Subscribe, share, and prepare for what Rome never saw coming. There was no thunder before the collapse, only the soft crunch of Roman sandals over wet leaves, and the growing sense that something wasn't right. This wasn't the front line. According to every scroll in the Roman archives, Germania was on its way to becoming just another compliant province. A thorn once, now trimmed. The tribes had submitted, signed treaties, and bowed before Roman standards, or so it seemed. At the center of this illusion stood Publius Quintilius Varus, governor of Germania, veteran of campaigns, and servant of Augustus Caesar. He did not march like a man expecting war. He moved like an administrator conducting a tour, His column stretched miles, not ranks. Ox-drawn carts carried court scribes and tax records, not siege weapons. His guards kept formation, but their eyes wandered. There were no fortifications, no scouting beyond protocol, only roads charted by faith in Roman dominion. But the forest around them did not share that faith. It had seen movement before, real movement, from men who knew to travel in silence, low to the earth, eyes sharpened by generations of ambush. And somewhere in that vast green shadow walked Arminius. He had once stood beside Varus, armored in Roman bronze, bearing Latin titles. He had shared wine with senators and memorized every formation in the Roman playbook. But that was the mask. Beneath it, his blood beat with tribal memory. He was the son of Curchusi soil, raised by conquerors, but born among the conquered. He knew what Rome had taken, and he knew how Rome thought it had won. That was his greatest weapon, predictability. Rome believed peace could be declared by decree, that loyalty could be purchased with rank and land, that silence in the woods meant submission. But silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's just the pause before the snare tightens. Varus was under immense political pressure. Augustus demanded results. Germania had to be stabilized, civilized, folded into the empire before the next census. His mission was not to conquer, it was to normalize, which meant taxes, courts, Roman law, everything but caution. He didn't see the fault lines forming beneath his feet. Behind him, in his own ranks, tribal auxiliaries rode with calm expressions and sharpened memories. Their families had been integrated, their lands pacified. But among them, Arminius whispered. He wasn't recruiting, he was revealing. They already hated Rome. They just needed someone who knew where to strike. And Varus gave him everything he needed. There were warnings, quiet ones, from allied chiefs with eyes too sharp and memories too long. They urged restraint, questioned the route. Some vanished, others were dismissed as alarmists, relics of a barbaric past too proud to accept Roman peace. But there was no peace. There was only delay. Arminius's genius was not in his sword, but in his patience. He didn't need to fight Rome in the open field. He just needed Rome to believe it had already won. And Varus, he believed it completely. He advanced into the forest, deeper and deeper, his lines growing longer, more brittle with each step. The column stretched past the point of protection. Formations dissolved into walking groups. Communication lines frayed. Supplies dragged behind. Morale was neither high nor low, just distracted. No alarms, no scouts running back in panic, just the steady march into a story already written. The Teutoburg Forest was not silent out of fear, it was waiting. Waiting for Varus to reach the point where turning back would take as long as going forward. Waiting for the Roman rhythm to settle into predictability. Waiting for Arminius to disappear without notice. And then waiting for the first scream. But that's for the next chapter. Because what Rome failed to see in those days of false calm was that loyalty enforced by arrogance will always come at a price. And in Germania, that price would soon be paid in full. There is a rhythm to every army, a pulse of orders, movement, reaction, correction. The Romans perfected that rhythm across continents, disciplined steps, trained responses, predictable outcomes. But in Teutoburg, that rhythm was shattered. Because Arminius wasn't just attacking men, he was attacking decisions. The OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act is how any force processes change. It's how commanders assess threats and respond in time to survive. And it's exactly where Arminius struck, not with overwhelming numbers, but with a war plan aimed at the mind. He observed Rome obsessively. As a Roman-trained officer, he'd marched with their legions drilled beside their centurions. He knew the exact timing of their maneuvers, the order of their commands, the spacing between cohorts. Every strength Rome believed in, he studied with a different purpose. And then he turned those strengths into weaknesses. Arminius knew Roman formations depended on flat terrain and clear lines of sight. The forest gave him neither. It gave him cover, height, angles, and time. He watched Varus's columns stretch thin along a narrow trail, shielded only by arrogance and rain. He listened to their campfires, not for plans, but for complacency. And then he oriented. Germanic warriors didn't fight in ranks. They fought in swarms, in packs, in ambush. They used trees as shields, mud as traps, and noise as confusion. Arminius didn't force them into Roman tactics. He adapted Roman predictability to Germanic chaos. He planned his strikes not on ground, but in the gaps between units. He didn't need to kill entire cohorts. He only needed to sever communication, isolate commands, create hesitation, and then multiply that hesitation across miles. His decision came in silence, not in grand declarations or war councils, but in whispered agreements across tribes once at odds. His leadership wasn't about domination, it was coordination, uniting a fractured resistance through a singular promise: Rome can bleed. When the time came to act, Arminius disappeared, not with loud defection, but a polite excuse. He had business with the tribes. He would return shortly. Varus nodded, trusted him, and by the time the general realized Arminius had taken his cavalry with him, the loop was already broken. Because Rome never completed a single cycle of observation, orientation, decision, and action in Teutoburg. They observed too late. They oriented to a threat that no longer followed the rules. They decided based on maps that didn't match the mud. And they acted not with initiative, but desperation. The loop collapsed under its own weight. In its place, Arminius launched wave after wave of ambushes, not to destroy, but to deconstruct, attack, vanish, attack again, from another side. No rhythm, no center, just confusion. The Roman mind was trained to respond to structure. Teutoburg offered none. And in that void, even veteran soldiers began to ask a question their training never prepared them for. What are we fighting? Because this wasn't war in the way Rome understood it. This was disintegration, a mental unraveling fed by shadows and betrayal. Arminius didn't need to win a battle. He needed to erase the very concept of what a Roman battle looked like. And in that forest, over days of rain, fear, and silence interrupted by terror, he did exactly that. There are many ways to defeat an army. Arminius chose the most efficient. Make them doubt their next move. Because once a legion hesitates, it dies, not by the enemy's blade, but by its own delay. And in Teutoburg, delay was the deadliest weapon of all. Maps told a story of order, routes, distances, elevations. But maps do not breathe. They do not shift beneath boots or swallow sound between trees. The Roman cartographers had drawn the roads of Germania. What they hadn't drawn was its resistance. Teutoburg was not a battlefield in the Roman sense. It was a labyrinth, a living organism with roots that tangled ankles, branches that cloaked movement, and mist that dulled vision. To Rome, it was an inconvenience. To Arminius, it was an ally. The forest's density alone was enough to fragment the cohesion of a marching column. Instead of a compact force, Varus now had a snake of men stretching over kilometers, unable to see each other, unable to communicate. Cohorts became islands. Legions moved like blind limbs. The terrain multiplied every Roman weakness. It narrowed their formations, disrupted their spacing, and stripped them of cavalry speed. Horses panicked in tight spaces. Chariots were useless. Banners disappeared in the canopy. Even the famed Roman discipline began to buckle. Because what good is a formation when you cannot form? Then came the rain. Not a storm, but a steady, soaking curtain that turned trails into trenches. Sandals lost grip, wagons stuck, tents collapsed, leather grew heavy, arrows hissed instead of whistled, firewood refused to catch, spears slipped in the mud before they reached their mark. The Germanic warriors, barefoot and low to the ground, moved differently. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't need clearings or signals. They knew the terrain not as landscape, but as inheritance. Every rise in the land was a lookout, every thicket a trap. Arminius had spent years mapping not roads, but delays. He understood that in war, the enemy doesn't always need to be faster. He just needs to make you slower. And slowly, step by muddy step, that vision of Roman control began to dissolve. The Roman line, so precise in open plains, now resembled a struggling caravan. It wasn't just about fatigue, it was erosion of morale, of momentum, of identity. These weren't legionnaires. The armor still clinked, the standard still waved, but what moved through that forest weren't legionnaires. They were tired, drenched men slipping in silence, squinting through the mist for orders that never came, following a general whose certainty had started to flicker like a torch in the rain. Military historian Antony Beevor reminds us, terrain and climate aren't just scenery in battle. They're silent allies, invisible commanders shaping the outcome before the first sword is drawn. In Teutoburg, that force was relentless. Every drop of rain, every fallen branch, every turn in the trail that led not to safety, but deeper into isolation. Rome didn't just face warriors, it faced the forest itself. And it was losing. Because when ground betrays you, when the sky offers no clarity, when your formation no longer means protection but confinement, you begin to question everything. The shield wall, that symbol of Roman unity, became a prison. Turn left, trees. Turn right, more trees. Look up, arrows. Look ahead, nothing. Look behind, too late. Form became a trap. And in that transformation, Rome lost more than men. It lost control. Not just of the battlefield, but of the very meaning of being Roman. A legion was no longer a machine. It was a target, a series of vulnerable clusters, each wondering why their signals had gone quiet, why the centurion hadn't returned, why the path behind looked as uncertain as the path ahead. This wasn't just nature. It was design. Because Arminius didn't ambush Rome by chance. He waited until the terrain itself had done half the work, until the forest had already weakened the formation, until the rain had dampened their vision and their pride. Only then did he strike. And by then, the Romans weren't marching into battle. They were already inside the jaws. They just hadn't realized it yet. The first strike didn't come from the trees. It came from absence. Arminius had promised to return. He rode off with calm eyes and familiar words, promising to return before dusk, his cavalry just a few turns behind. Varus didn't question it. Why would he? Arminius had ridden beside him for seasons. But as the sun slid lower and the trees grew closer, the sound of hoofbeats never returned. What filled the space instead wasn't silence. It was a tension that clung to the skin, like the forest itself had paused to listen. The path ahead no longer felt like a route. It felt like a narrowing throat. And then the realization. He wasn't coming back. It didn't begin with steel. It began with doubt, quiet, creeping, suffocating. A whisper among officers, a glance between scouts, a pause in the march. Where is Arminius? By the time the question took root, the betrayal was already complete, because what followed wasn't just a military ambush, it was a psychological collapse triggered at the precise moment Rome stopped believing in itself. In the Roman worldview, betrayal was the ultimate disruption. Command structures thrived on discipline, on hierarchy, on trust reinforced through blood and duty. To lose a man to the enemy was tragedy, but to lose a trusted ally to the enemy's side, that was devastation, especially when that ally had sat beside you in war councils, translated tribal grievances, and pledged allegiance in Latin. Varus had ignored warnings. Other Germanic chiefs had spoken in hushed tones of shifting loyalties, of gatherings in the north that didn't match seasonal patterns, but he dismissed them. To act on suspicion was to disrupt the image of control, and Rome valued that image above all. Now that image shattered. The Germanic auxiliaries, once seen as mere support units, had vanished, first from the flanks, then from the rear. Their departure was not loud, it was surgical. Arminius didn't need to remove them in battle. He had planned their disappearance like a ghost withdrawing its shadow. And then came the signal. Historians debate whether it was a horn, a fire, or a shouted name. But it wasn't the sound itself that mattered, it was the symbolism. The betrayal was no longer quiet. It had a shape, a volume, a face. That face was Arminius, no longer the Roman knight, but the tribal commander his people had been waiting for. And with that signal, the forest erupted. From the underbrush, from behind boulders, from above in the trees, javelins flew, not in volley, but in rhythm, the kind that interrupts thought. Roman shields turned upward, then sideways, then backward, but the attacks had no direction. They came from everywhere and nowhere. The legion's formation, already stretched and battered, began to fray, not from wounds, but from questions. Who's leading? Where are the cavalry? Why did Arminius leave? Is this the end? In battle, answers matter less than certainty, and now Rome had neither. What followed wasn't chaos, it was collapse. Varus tried to reassert control. He ordered rally points, shouted for standards, called for reinforcements that would never arrive. But his voice didn't carry through trees. His orders echoed back to him in fragments, distorted by distance and fear. And as realization spread among the ranks, a deeper wound opened. Emotional collapse. These weren't just soldiers being attacked. These were men confronting the betrayal of the very structure they were sworn to uphold. Their commander hadn't failed them by losing. He had failed them by not seeing it coming. That's what broke them. It wasn't the first javelin. It was the moment a centurion looked to his side for instruction and found nothing but leaves. Arminius had not merely defected, he had detonated trust. And in a Roman army, once trust implodes, everything else follows. The Teutoburg Forest didn't echo with the clash of steel. It echoed with disbelief, with the weight of a betrayal so precise, so personal. It didn't just kill, it unmade. And in that silence between volleys, Rome began to understand. They hadn't lost the battle. They had lost the narrative. And now they were just trying to survive inside a story no longer written by them. The legions were trained for battlefields with edges, front lines, flanks, rears, places where you knew where your enemy stood, where your sword should swing, where your eyes should look. Teutoburg had none of that. There were no hills to climb and hold, no open fields to form a line, only trees, miles of them, standing like silent spectators to a struggle that no longer looked like war, but like unraveling. The genius of Arminius wasn't in the ambush itself. It was in how he removed the Roman ability to define the threat. He didn't attack a line. He erased the idea that a line existed. The first volleys came from nowhere. Javelins, stones, slings, but not in barrages, in pulses, in rhythms. First to the left, then the rear, then silence, then again from the front. It was not coordinated in the Roman sense. It was psychological, designed to disrupt, not destroy, to move the Roman mind toward exhaustion before the body ever broke. And that's where the true damage began. Orders no longer followed sequence. Signals were misread or never sent. One cohort turned to reinforce another and disappeared into the fog. Another panicked and pulled back, leaving gaps that no commander had prepared for. Rome's famed discipline had turned inward, every man reacting to his own fear instead of to the commander's voice. What Arminius understood better than any Roman general that day was this: a force doesn't need to be surrounded by men. It can be surrounded by confusion. Cut off movement, block the path, break the rhythm. That's how a snake coils, not with speed, but with pressure. There was no decisive clash. There was only a slow squeeze. Carts overturned. Cavalry scattered. The forest seemed to press inward with every hour, tightening the corridor until marching meant squeezing through mud between trees, hoping not to hear the next scream too close. The moment the rear became the front, Rome was lost. No one knew where the enemy would strike next, so they began looking everywhere. That's the cost of being surrounded, not physically, but psychologically. When danger comes from all directions, you lose direction, not just on the map, but in the mind. By the third day, formation was no longer a concept. It had crumbled into survival clusters. Pockets of men huddled behind what was left of the baggage trains or dug shallow defenses among tree roots. They didn't fight as legions. They fought as scattered remnants, gripping shields not in strategy, but in desperation. Sun Tzu once warned, "When you surround an army, leave an outlet." Arminius did not. He left the Romans with choices that weren't really choices at all. Move forward into more forest. Retreat into ambush. Hold position and wait for the next wave. That was the brilliance. The encirclement wasn't about walls of warriors. It was about removing escape from the Roman mind, making every path look like death, making standing still feel like drowning. And so they fell, not in glorious ranks, but in broken silence, one group at a time. And in the heart of that forest, Rome wasn't fighting a people anymore. It was fighting doubt. And doubt in war kills faster than any blade ever forged. Even before the first javelin flew, Rome was bleeding. Not from the chest, but from the gut. The legions that marched into the Teutoburg Forest were not built for independence. They were built to be supplied. Daily, predictably, like clockwork. Their discipline, their order, their strength, it all fed on the lifeline that trailed behind them. Carts, oxen, provisions, blacksmiths, scribes. A rolling artery of food, weapons, and direction. Once that lifeline broke, everything else began to rot from the inside. The Germanic tribes understood this intimately. They didn't just target soldiers, they targeted support. They struck the baggage trains with ruthless precision, not because it would win the day, but because it would steal tomorrow. What disappeared weren't just tools and tents, it was hope. because a legion without food is not a fighting force. It's a procession of hunger. The rains came harder. Firewood vanished. Meat spoiled. Bread molded. Arrows ran short. Horses collapsed in mud and were stripped for what little nourishment their bones could give. And still the Romans moved forward, dragging carts with ropes like slaves, cutting leather into straps to chew, melting snow in helmets to drink. It was a slow, invisible death. Varus had not prepared for this. He had assumed a smooth passage, backed by stable lines of reinforcement. But those lines had no redundancy, no alternate route, no fallback. There was one way in, and now no way out. He had gambled on order in a land that was never ordered. Arminius had studied the Roman supply doctrine. He knew how far a legion could march without rest. He knew the weight of iron armor in wet terrain. He knew where they cached reserves. And he knew that once those were gone, what remained was exhaustion. Some soldiers began to bury their coins, unwilling to carry wealth that now meant nothing. Others hoarded rations and were cut down by their own for doing so. Centurions broke rank not to flee, but to scavenge. The sense of unit dissolved. Men no longer marched with purpose, but stumbled with burden. They didn't ask where the enemy was. They asked when they would eat. The Germanic warriors didn't need to chase them. They simply waited for the weight of empty stomachs and sleepless nights to crush whatever willpower Roman pride had left. There are many ways to kill an army. One of the oldest and quietest is to starve it of motion. Not just the motion of legs, but of spirit. A legion that cannot eat cannot fight. A force that cannot be resupplied cannot hold a position. And an empire that cannot feed its soldiers cannot call itself an empire. It becomes a memory in the mud. That's what Teutoburg was becoming. Not a battlefield, but a burial ground, one ration at a time. True command isn't proven under banners or inscripted drills. It's revealed when the ground shifts beneath your feet, when voices crack and every pair of eyes turns to you, pleading for clarity. But in Teutoburg, those eyes began to look away, not out of defiance, out of quiet dread. Because when the man at the center starts to flinch, trust doesn't break. It slips, slowly, like rope through a bleeding hand. For Publius Quinctilius Varus, those moments came faster than he could react. A standard rose on one ridge, a horn cried out from somewhere deeper. But none of it fit together, like instruments from different songs clashing in the dark. Cohorts moved without knowing where or why. And then, silence. An entire unit gone, as if the trees had swallowed them whole. And in the hollows left behind, a murmur passed from one soldier to the next, not shouted, not written, just breathed like a prayer. Who do we follow now? In the first wave of attacks, he froze, not out of cowardice, but disbelief. He had trusted Arminius. He had believed the tribes pacified, the region stable. But in Teutoburg, belief became a coffin. The decisions that followed were slow, fractured, contradictory. Stand and regroup, push forward, hold position, retreat. The orders came as waves, uncoordinated, desperate, clashing. Commanders lower in rank looked to Varus and saw what they feared most: doubt. A general unsure is a general undone. His pauses became fractures in the chain of command. His gestures, once firm, became tentative. And those beneath him, sensing the unraveling, began to pull back, not just physically, but emotionally. Loyalty frays when leadership falters, and in that forest, the fraying turned to free fall. One by one, senior officers fell, not just to blades, but to disorientation. Scouts misread terrain, messengers vanished, signals failed. The legions, usually a system of flawless hierarchy, now moved in fragments. A standard lifted here, a horn sounded there, each one uncoordinated with the next. Entire units vanished into the mist, never to be seen again. And with each officer's death, a silent contagion spread through the ranks. Who's in charge now? Rome had always held itself as invincible, disciplined, eternal. But Teutoburg cracked that illusion. The myth didn't shatter in a single blow, it crumbled under fire. With every misstep, every unacknowledged command, every failed regrouping, the soldiers began to feel it, the terrifying reality that leadership was no longer a shield, but a shadow. Historian David Glantz described this phenomenon with clarity. When leadership is targeted and removed, it's not just the head that dies. The limbs panic, the body convulses, the entire system forgets how to move. That's what was happening in the woods. The forest didn't just strip Rome of terrain, it stripped it of direction. And Varus, wounded in both spirit and body, felt that weight closing in. His maps were useless, his counselors gone. His decisions were echoes in a storm that no longer listened. By the final day, command had become myth. Men fought in isolated pockets, not under orders, but under instinct, not for victory, but for breath. Leadership had dissolved, not with ceremony or final decree, but under pressure, confusion, and betrayal. In Teutoburg, Rome did not lose because it was outnumbered. It lost because it no longer believed it was led. They didn't speak of glory, not anymore. When the last scattered survivors found each other beneath the dripping branches, their mouths were too dry for commands, too tired for ceremony. No one barked orders, no one tried to inspire. They just looked at each other, mud-covered, shaking, eyes emptied by days of fear, and stood a little closer because that's all they had left. Just breathing. Heavy. One man gripped his shield not like a weapon, but like a memory, something that reminded him of home, of purpose. Another just watched the treetops sway, blinking through the rain, as if hoping the branches might open up and show him a way out, or at least a reason this hadn't all been for nothing. What remained of 3 legions stood in a loose ring, an instinct older than any doctrine. Shoulder to shoulder, not to hold a line, but to feel someone still alive beside them. The forest pressed in, not with sound, but with silence, the kind that weighs on your chest, that makes your hands shake without reason. No one was coming. There were no reinforcements, no flares on the horizon, no signal from the rear, because there was no rear. That had vanished days ago, somewhere between the mud and the screams. What stood now were not legions. They were men, tired, cold, hungry, stripped of armor where it had grown too heavy, stripped of illusions where they had grown too blind. Some had wounds that would never clot. Others hadn't spoken in hours. Their eyes said enough. A few had buried friends. Most hadn't had time. They weren't waiting to win. They were waiting to be remembered. And in the center of them, Varus. He said little. What was there to say? His words had led them here. His maps, his trust in a man who spoke perfect Latin, who had dined with them, who had promised peace. That peace had turned to fog, to mud, to silence. Varus didn't shout. He didn't need to. The soldiers weren't looking to be led. They just wanted to stand one more time as Romans, together. They formed the circle, not because it would save them, but because it was the only shape left that still felt like order. A final outline against chaos, a memory of who they were before the forest swallowed their names. The rain hadn't stopped in days. It soaked into the ground, into their bones, into every crease of leather and wound. The forest floor had turned soft, too soft. When a man fell, he didn't thud, he sank. And they began to fall. Not to swords always, sometimes just from the weight, from cold, from the knowledge that they wouldn't make it through another hour. No one ran. Every direction had already turned on them. Forward meant more trees. Behind meant ghosts. They weren't standing because they had options. They were standing because there was nothing else left to do. The ones still upright weren't hoping to turn the tide. They held their places because it felt like the only way to keep their fear from spilling out. As long as they stood together, even for just a little longer, they weren't just dying. They were trying to matter. To stand together, even now, was the last thing they could choose. Arrows came in low arcs. A javelin struck and disappeared into flesh with a sound like wet wood splitting, and still they didn't break. Some prayed, not loudly, not to the gods of Rome, just under their breath, words shaped like home, like names, like regret. Others looked to Varus and saw him drawing his sword not for a final charge, but for something else. He turned it inward. It wasn't honor, it wasn't theater, it was surrender, not to the enemy, but to the truth. He had no orders left to give. When he fell, the circle broke, not with panic, but with understanding. There were no horns to mark the end, no records written in real time. Only the rain, only the trees, only men dying, not as warriors or heroes, but as humans, quiet, desperate, still hoping that someone, somewhere, would remember what they tried to hold on to. That last stand wasn't a defense. It was a final act of identity. After Teutoburg, Rome still stood. Its temples still gleamed, its armies still trained, its roads still stretched like veins across continents. But something beneath that strength had shifted. And not all at once. It crept in, like cold in the bones after a wound that wouldn't close. Because Rome didn't just lose legions in the forest, it lost nerve. The three standards, the eagles, were gone, carried off not just as trophies, but as messages. Symbols carved in gold, now reminders of a humiliation no legionary ever forgot. The empire could have retaliated. It had the numbers, the metal, the maps, and yet it paused. That pause became policy. There were counterattacks, yes. Germanicus led campaigns in the years that followed, fought in the same forests, buried Roman dead, recovered one eagle, built pyres where brothers had once been lost without graves. But even his victories felt like shadows of something that could no longer be reclaimed. Germania had changed, not the soil, not the trees, but the idea of it. It was no longer a land to be tamed. It had become a scar, deep, emotional, and unspoken. Inside the Senate walls, where men once spoke of destiny with absolute conviction, there was hesitation. Augustus, the architect of expansion, received news of Varus's defeat not as a ruler preparing a counterstrike, but as a father losing something irreplaceable. He wasn't angry, he was broken. Historical accounts speak of him wandering the halls of the Palatine, unshaven, mumbling to himself over and over, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Not rebuild them, not avenge them. Give them back. As if part of Rome had vanished that couldn't be remade. Strategically, the empire recalibrated. The Rhine, once a launch point, became a border. Forts were reinforced. Outposts were locked tighter. But there would be no permanent pushback into the heart of Germania. No Roman cities on the Elbe Garnau. No aqueducts running through tribal lands. Just maps that stopped earlier. Quieter. Why? Because the cost of returning wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. Teutoburg had seeded a fear deep and institutional. The kind that doesn't make itself known in speeches or scrolls, but in the caution that slips into every decision after, in the sideways glances, in the drawn-out silences during council meetings, in the way generals double-check loyalty where they used to assume it. The empire feared not just the tribes, it feared another mistake, another Arminius, another Forest that looked too calm. Rome wasn't defeated, but it was shaken. And history shows that sometimes that's enough. Enough to make an empire stop growing. Enough to make it question where its reach ends and where the shadows begin. So it didn't return. Not fully, not with cities, not with senators, only with caution. Because after Teutoburg, Germania wasn't just a territory. It was a reminder that even giants can be caught off balance if they step forward without seeing what waits beneath the trees. We talk about betrayal like it's a crack in someone's character, like it's personal, shameful. But sometimes it's none of that. Sometimes betrayal is just the name we give to someone choosing a different truth, a personal fracture. But in Teutoburg, it wasn't personal. It was calculated, cold, strategic. Arminius didn't betray Varus for revenge. He didn't do it out of impulse or pride. He did it with precision. Because betrayal, when timed right, is more devastating than any weapon forged in iron. And what happened in that forest was not a rebellion. It was something far more complex. It was a war fought in layers. On the surface, it looked like an ambush, but underneath, it was a collapse orchestrated from within. A hybrid operation long before the term existed. Arminius blended the language of diplomacy with the instincts of guerrilla warfare. He didn't stand across from Rome, he stood inside it, and then turned its own structure against itself. He used Roman trust as a root, Roman discipline as a blindfold, Roman arrogance as a door left wide open. This wasn't just strategy, it was understanding how empires operate, how they expect obedience, how they dismiss the cultures they conquer. Rome didn't see Arminius coming not because he was hidden, but because he was familiar, too familiar, a decorated officer, a son of their system. And that's what made him so dangerous. He wasn't leading an army, he was conducting a psychological operation disguised as friendship. The lesson wasn't lost on those who survived, or on those who studied the forest from afar. B.H. Littlehart would describe the essence of modern strategy as indirect, the art of striking where your enemy feels safest. Arminius didn't read Hart, but he lived that principle to perfection. He knew that Rome didn't just need soldiers, it needed stories. It needed the myth of order, of loyalty, of absorbed provinces falling in line. And in that gap between story and reality, he struck. The tribes didn't fight like Romans. They didn't wear uniform armor. They didn't march in cadence. But they didn't need to, because Rome didn't lose in Teutoburg because it was weaker. It lost because it didn't adapt. It brought walls to a forest, formation to chaos, logic to fury, and most of all, it brought rules to a war that had none. The empire failed not just militarily, but culturally. It misunderstood the terrain, the politics, the pain buried in tribal memory. It assumed honor codes were universal, that a pact once signed held the same weight for all. But for Arminius, the betrayal wasn't dishonor, it was strategy. Because to him, and to many in those woods, Roman loyalty was a uniform stitched onto the skin, not a truth rooted in the soul. When the moment came and the weight of both worlds pressed in, Arminius didn't reach for loyalty, he reached for what felt like justice. Not to repay what Rome gave him, but to answer for what it took from his own blood. He chose to be effective. Rome would never forget that lesson. It would redefine how it handled the edges of its world. It would learn to question its own pride, to fortify not just walls, but assumptions. Because betrayal, when used as a weapon, doesn't just pierce the heart of an army. It reprograms how that army thinks. And in Teutoburg, that reprogramming began with a man who wore the Roman eagle until the moment it no longer served him.
History rarely leaves room for ambiguity. It prefers clean lines, victors and villains, traitors and patriots. But Arminius didn't fit into any of those boxes. He blurred them. To some, he was the liberator of Germania, the man who stood against Rome and shattered the illusion of its invincibility. To others, he was a traitor, not to the empire, but to the idea of stability, to the order he once enforced under its banner. He carried both identities, a Roman officer in training, a Germanic war chief by blood. He moved between languages, between customs, between loyalties, and for a time he made both worlds believe he belonged entirely to them. But no one truly owns a man torn between origins. After the victory at Teutoburg, Arminius stood on the edge of something rare, power unchallenged. The legions were gone. The Roman frontier had recoiled. Tribal leaders looked to him not just as a warrior, but as a symbol. Someone who had defeated the largest empire on earth in their own land using their own tools. But symbols don't govern. Arminius soon discovered that leading a rebellion was very different from leading a people. He had united tribes under the promise of revenge, of freedom from Roman rule. But once the threat withdrew, so did the cohesion. Tribal unity, hard won under pressure, began to fray in peace. Old rivalries resurfaced. Pride reasserted itself. He tried to shape something permanent out of the fire, to build structure from chaos. But the same men who had followed him into battle now resisted his commands in council. To the tribes, Arminius was no longer just a hero. He was beginning to look like a ruler. and rulers, they had learned, too often become conquerors of their own people. His downfall didn't come from Rome. It came from within. Bit by bit, support unraveled. Allies turned wary. Respect turned into suspicion. And eventually, blades turned to his back. Assassinated not by foreigners, but by those who once called him brother. He had won the forest, but he couldn't hold the future. Arminius lived and died inside the contradiction he had created. He was not Roman enough to be trusted by Rome, not tribal enough to be trusted by Germania. He belonged to both worlds, and in the end, to neither. That's the tragedy behind the triumph. He didn't just dismantle an empire's march. He exposed the cost of standing between two identities that never fully accept you. And when the last breath left his body, it didn't mark the end of a campaign. It marked the silence of a man who had tried to become more than a symbol, only to learn that symbols, once worshipped, are often discarded. Hero? Traitor? Revolutionary? Maybe Arminius was none of those things. Maybe he was just the one who saw clearly, for a moment, what everyone else refused to admit. That empires fall not when they're destroyed from without, but when the ones within start asking different questions. The forest of Teutoburg may be quiet now, but its lessons never stopped moving. You can find them in military academies, in strategy manuals, in the whispered warnings passed between commanders before they enter unfamiliar ground. Not because it was the deadliest battle Rome ever fought, but because it revealed how quickly strength unravels when certainty becomes assumption. Modern generals study Teutoburg not for its body count, but for its blind spots. They trace the failure not to swords or numbers, but to trust misplaced, to maps trusted more than men, to voices that should have been heard but were dismissed because they didn't speak in the right tongue or wear the right uniform. The terrain was brutal, the betrayal surgical, but the real power of what happened in that forest is in how it changed what came after. Rome never again marched into Germania with the same confidence. Its doctrine evolved, reinforcement structures were reimagined, chain of command systems were hardened, but more than that, Rome learned to ask a question it had long ignored. What if the next enemy isn't outside the gate, but sitting at the table? Today, the principles born in that forest echo in doctrines of hybrid warfare and counterinsurgency, the blending of cultural intelligence with battlefield awareness, the importance of terrain not just as geography but as a character in the fight, the awareness that supply lines are not logistical details, they are lifelines, and the realization that leadership, once questioned, can collapse faster than any wall breached. Instructors now speak of psychological pressure as a tactic, of betrayal not as a personal drama, but a strategic method. In special forces briefings and war college case studies, Arminius has become more than a figure from antiquity. He is a lens through which commanders understand vulnerability. Because if Rome, the most disciplined, structured, and resource-rich military machine of its time, could be brought to its knees not by superior force, but by deception in the right place at the right time, then any army, anywhere, can fall the same way. That's the legacy. Not the bodies in the mud, not even the shattered standards that were never fully recovered. The real impact of Teutoburg lives in the minds of those planning the next operation, reading the next intelligence report, walking into the next negotiation. It lives in the hesitation before a decision, in the second look at a trusted ally, in the question asked too late the last time, what don't we see? That forest never stopped speaking. Some still listen.
Teutoburg was not a battle.
It was a rupture, not just of legions, but of belief. In that forest, Rome didn't just lose soldiers, it lost the comfort of certainty. The kind that had marched across continents unchecked, the kind that believed discipline alone could bend any land to its will. But no formation could withstand the silence that came after. Because silence doesn't just mark the end. Sometimes it marks the start of something deeper. Teutoburg forced the empire to look inward, to reckon with the myth it had told itself for too long, that loyalty could be bought, that terrain was a background, that enemies would always come wearing different clothes. Arminius didn't just win a battle, he forced Rome to redraw its imagination. The empire that once expanded by default now stood still, not out of mercy, but out of memory. It wasn't just geography that changed, it was doctrine, recruitment, logistics, suspicion. Rome learned that collapse can begin from inside the tent, from the hand that pours the wine, from the voice that once swore allegiance with perfect Latin. And in that realization, something unspoken took root, that every command decision carries a seed, not of victory, but of collapse. A wrong appointment, a missed signal, a misread alliance. The difference between conquest and catastrophe is sometimes just a name on the wrong scroll. Clausewitz once wrote that war is the continuation of politics by other means. But Teutoburg shows us something else, that war also reveals what politics tries to hide, the limits of control, the cost of pride, the weight of assumptions. In the end, the trees swallowed the legions, and yet they left behind something louder than memory. They left behind a warning, because some defeats aren't erased by time. They echo, they reshape, they linger. And somewhere in the stillness of the forest that once devoured Rome's might, the ground still holds the breath of that day. Not as legend, but as lesson, still waiting, still alive. So the forest closed in, and the echo of that day still shapes how we see power, trust, and the edge of ambition. If this journey moved you, if the silence after Teutoburg still lingers, then don't stop here. Join us for the next untold fracture of history, the Persian mistake Leonidas exploited, Thermopylae documentary. Because some battles become legend not by who fought them, but what they revealed. Subscribe, share, and come see what happens when the myth of invincibility meets its reckoning again.